We are just over 3 weeks away from Orioles opening day, so why not start to preview the season? We'll go position by position, starting today with catchers, first baseman, and DHs. That's coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, March 5th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are beginning our positional preview series for the Orioles 2025 season. For a few episodes here, we're going to get a couple of positions in each episode. We're going to preview the players who will be presumably starting at those positions for the Orioles in 2025, at least to begin the year. We'll talk about the bench guys and kind of the depth guys at the top of the minor leagues at those positions who could help the Orioles out. And then we'll talk about the prospects that are making their way towards the big leagues that could be kind of the future players to fill those positions. And today, catcher, first base, and DH begins that series. We'll, of course, talk about Adley Rutschman, how he bounces back, what kind of role Gary Sanchez fills as the backup, the split between Ryan Mountcastle and Ryan O'Hearn, and when we could see Samuel Basallo in an Orioles uniform. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Before we get there, though, just did want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first listen of the day. Locked On Orioles podcast, we are here 5 days a week leading up to the start of this 2025 Orioles season. You can get the pod wherever you listen to podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever it may be. Make sure to subscribe to the show, leave a 5-star rating and a review. It really, really helps out the pod. And we're here on YouTube as well. Sometimes there are some extra graphics on the YouTube channel. You can see my face if you'd really like to while watching or listening to the show. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. And if you have any thoughts about the show, questions about the Orioles, questions for me, mailbag questions to submit, you can always send those to lockedonorioles@gmail.com. So let's dive right into it today. We talked about on yesterday's episode kind of what went wrong in the second half of Adley Rutschman's 2024 season. Make sure to go back and check that one out if you have not already. And now we dive into the positional previews. And I wanted to start it with catcher and first base and DH to kind of split these things up, because I think Adley is on the top of people's minds, not just because he's still seemingly the face of this franchise, but we know how poorly it went down the stretch for Rutschman in 2024. And the questions are surrounding, like, how much does he play? Do they cut his playing time? Do they put him in there more? How do they stop what happened last year from happening again in 2025? So let's begin with kind of the main starters at these positions: catcher, first base, and DH for the Orioles in 2025. And of course, your main catcher is going to be Adley Rutschman. We know it was a down year for him in 2024. He finished with a 104 WRC plus, meaning overall he was just 4% better than a league average hitter, which is still good for a catcher. But for Adley Rutschman, who had a 127 WRC plus in 2023 and was an all-star level player in the first half, what he did down the stretch was not good. A 70 WRC plus after the all-star break for Adley last year. You don't love that. Now, I think it stemmed from an injury. We broke that down further on yesterday's episode. So again, definitely go back and listen to that one first if you have not already. But it's not something that Adley and the Orioles have really admitted. And they've said, and he said he's worked a lot on his body and on himself throughout the offseason, and he's ready to go in 2025. But you know, whether it was some sort of back issue he was dealing with or getting hit on the hand, they haven't fully said. We're just kind of here to guess at this point. And what I do think, though, with Adley is, as I talked about yesterday, a bounce back season is absolutely coming for Adley. The Fangraphs projections have him around a 120 WRC plus with 20 home runs and a solid defensive catcher as well. You put that all together, that's an all-star season. And if it's a 120 WRC plus, I think that's fine if it comes with good defense. And I'll take the over for Adley's offensive output. I think we see something closer to 130, closer to what we saw in his first truly full big league season in 2023. He looks a little in better shape. He's looked good in spring so far. I'm all in on the Adley bounce back this year. Now, Fangraphs has him projected to play 146 of the Orioles' 162 games this season. And that is really the other big question. Like, how much does Adley play? And how much do they base that on him not wanting to get injured, not wanting to wear down, not wanting what happened last year to happen again? Now, he played 148 games last season. These are just games he appeared in at all. So that could be starting at catcher, starting at DH, or coming off the bench defensively, or as a pinch hitter at any part. He was in 148. So he got 14 full days off. Fangraphs projection to get 16 full days off. I think that sounds about right. He started 99 games behind the plate last year, 104 of them 2 years ago. I would project Adley to start about 100 games of the 162 behind the dish. I think that's pretty normal for a catcher of his caliber, for with a team that has a backup they trust, bringing in Gary Sanchez on a one-year deal. We'll get to Sanchez a little bit later in this episode. But I think 100 games behind the plate, at least starting, is totally fine for Adley. And it's not that he's going to be in there for 100, pinch hit some, and that'll be it. He's going to DH a lot, and he's done that in the past too. Adley was the starting DH 42 times last season. Like, the O's are very used to putting him in there as the designated hitter, and I think absolutely they will do it again this year. Only Ryan O'Hearn with 51 games as the DH last year did it more than Adley in 2024. And I think what the Orioles will mostly do is, when the Orioles are facing a lefty, I think they will give Adley a half day off. They'll have him DH, and they'll allow Gary Sanchez to catch, because Sanchez with the Brewers last year got a whole lot better defensively, and he's a guy who's a right-handed bat who you want in there generally, not every time, but generally against left-handed pitching. Now, I'm not saying against every single left-handed starter are the Orioles going to start Gary behind the plate and Adley at DH, but on a good chunk of them, I think they are. And that is where Adley will find his other ABs. And also, there will be times, we've seen it in the past, where he's not in the starting lineup, right? Sanchez is catching, someone else is DHing, Adley's getting a day off, but it's a big spot late in the game, and they use Adley as a pinch hitter. They're certainly going to do that at times as well, just to get him on the field. But I think 10 to 15 full days off where he doesn't see the field, totally fine with me, just to keep him ready for the end of the season and ready, hopefully, for the postseason this year. I think that's how they will handle his playing time this year. Again, he's not going to start a day game after a night game. That is how every team treats every starting catcher in Major League Baseball. Some people still get annoyed about that. That is how you keep these guys fresh. It is the most physically grueling position in the game, is being a starting catcher. So it's not going to matter as much pitcher handedness when it's a day game after a night game. That's when he'll probably, if it's a right-handed pitcher on the mound, day game after a night game, that's probably when Adley will get his full days off, where at most he gets used as a pinch hitter. Now, moving out to first base, and again, the main starter this year will be Ryan Mountcastle. At this point, he's in Orioles camp. The O's have not traded him. We know there's been talks of that at the deadline last year and a little bit of murmurs this offseason as well, but he's a free agent after 2026. He is still an Oriole at this point. And he's probably the player on this entire roster. And this is an Orioles team where it's kind of tough to project out playing time, because there seems to be, you could argue there's 11 starter level players at 9 spots in the lineup every single day. It's really tough to parse out how the Orioles are going to do this. And if you maybe pick one player who you have the least feel for how much and how often and when he's going to play this season, I think that one player is Ryan Mountcastle. I still have a lot of questions myself that I can't really answer about how the Orioles are going to fully use Mountcastle throughout this 2025 season. And maybe that is an indicator that he's still on the trading block. And if the Orioles were to find a deal at the deadline in 2025, Mountcastle could be on the move mid-season to open up some more plate appearances for other people. That is totally possible. The one thing we know is Ryan Mountcastle will be playing first base every single time a left-handed pitcher is on the mound for the Orioles opponent. You expect that 40 to 50 times out of the year, you probably face a lefty. You know Mountcastle is going to be at first base in the middle of that order. He continues to crush lefties. He is still a huge asset to have in there. He had a 134 WRC plus against lefties last year, 108 overall, 98 against righties. Basically, he was a league average hitter against righties, and he was all-star level against lefties. That is who they had in Ryan Mountcastle. But they also had a guy who had a 27% pull rate, which was the lowest of the qualified hitters in Major League Baseball. Now, some of that had to do with the wall and left. The Orioles are moving it back in some. That should help Mountcastle this season, but we just don't know how much. So the question is, yeah, he'll play against lefties, and in games he doesn't start against righties. As soon as a lefty comes in there to face Ryan O'Hearn, Mountcastle is going to pitch for O'Hearn. It really does. It could be in the 5th inning. And Brandon Hyde feels comfortable putting Mountcastle in there because he's still okay if Mountcastle has to face a righty or two later in the game. If it's a big spot in the 5th or 6th to get Mountcastle in there against a lefty. So he's done that a lot in the past too, where him and O'Hearn will basically split games, but depending on matchups, he'll get some of that playing time as well. But it's really hard to parse what the O's are going to do matchup-wise. Against lefties, again, he's going to be in there, right? Against a lot of lefties, you'll have Gary Sanchez catching, Adley DHing, then Mountcastle at first, then maybe, Cowser in center, O'Neill in left, potentially Laureano in right. And then if it's a day against a lefty where Adley is catching, you may DH Gary Sanchez, but that would allow you to potentially still get Heston Kjerstad into that lineup as well. Against lefties, the Orioles are going to sit Cedric Mullins and sit Ryan O'Hearn. Otherwise, there could be a lot of different combinations, but you also know they're going to play Tyler O'Neill. They're going to play Ryan Mountcastle. They're going to play Adley Rutschman pretty much every time against a lefty because those guys match left-handed pitching. And then, of course, your everyday guys like, Gunner's going to be in there. Westberg's going to be in there. They're going to try to fit Arias in. They're going to try to fit Laureano in, but not every single time. The question is what the Orioles do against righties. Now, whether Adley's catching or Gary Sanchez is catching, I think the other one will be on the bench most of the time if it is a right-handed starter. Again, I mentioned, right-handed starting pitcher on the other team, day game after a night game. That's probably when Gary Sanchez catches. Adley gets the full day off. We know Ryan O'Hearn is going to be in there against right-handed pitching. That's where he excels. We know the Orioles are going to get Cedric Mullins in there against right-handed pitching. His defense in center, that is where he excels. But after that, where does everyone fall? And I think at least at the beginning of the season, Adley catching, you'll still see Mountcastle at first, O'Hearn at DH, Mullins in center, Cowser in left, and then it's either Kjerstad or Tyler O'Neill in right field. That's another question with Tyler O'Neill. He mashes lefties. The Orioles gave him a 3-year deal and paid him like an everyday player, but are they going to play him against every right-handed pitcher? Because he's kind of like Mountcastle, where he mashes lefties, but he's more of a average to slightly below average hitter against righties, and you're just going to face way more righties than lefties, which makes this kind of an interesting problem to figure out. Like, what are the Orioles going to do with Mountcastle and O'Neill when facing righties? And I do think what the answer will be, as I turn on my desk lamp here in the middle of an episode, I think what the answer might be is one of Mountcastle or O'Neill is going to sit versus most righties, and the other one's going to play. And it's basically going to be about who is swinging the bat best. Because if you sit Mountie, you can go O'Hearn at first, and you can put O'Neill in the outfield with Kjerstad as your DH. You're going to want to get him in there against right-handed pitching. And then if it's Mountcastle who's playing and O'Neill is sitting, well, you have Mountcastle at first, O'Hearn at DH, and then Kjerstad's in that right field spot, and O'Neill can come off the bench at some point. That makes it easier. I just don't know what they're going to make that rotation between Mountcastle and O'Neill. I know they're going to like having that depth, and there's going to be injuries, and that depth is going to come up even bigger, and it's allow Hyde to get some guys some days off, and Mountcastle dealing with the vertigo. He needs some days off sometimes. We know all the struggles Tyler O'Neill has had with injury in his career. I think giving him actually more days off against righties than Mountcastle gets could help preserve him and keep him off the IL for the season, even if it means that he only plays in 120 or 130 games. If he's available the whole year, I think that's more helpful for the Orioles because he struggled to do that throughout his career. It's going to be certainly a puzzle for Brandon Hyde. And most projections for Mountcastle have him, 110 to 120 WRC plus. Like, it's interesting to see what the wall is going to do for him. I don't think many people know, not even the projection system. So I'm fascinated and have many questions about Mountcastle, but that layout right there is kind of my best guess at what happens. And then at DH, like, your main starter is going to be Ryan O'Hearn. That's what it was last year, 51 starts at DH, more than anyone. He's going to play some first base. Again, in the games where Mountie's sitting against a righty, it will be O'Hearn at first base. But when they're both in there, Mountcastle, Mountcastle was a Gold Glove finalist last year. He is a much superior defensive first baseman to O'Hearn. So if both are in there, O'Hearn will be the DH. Mountcastle will be the first baseman. But Ryan O'Hearn will play first base. He got 51 starts at DH last year, 48 starts at first base, and 20 starts in the outfield. Now, I doubt Ryan O'Hearn plays much, if any, outfield this year. They are deeper in the outfield. The O's are probably going to roster 5 outfielders to begin the year with Mullins, Cowser, O'Neill, Kjerstad, and Laureano. And you have a guy like Dylan Carlson ready to come up at any time in AAA. You got some prospects knocking on the door. Like, yeah, Ryan O'Hearn might start 3 or 4 games in the outfield, but I don't think it'll be anywhere close to the 20 he played in the outfield last year. And overall, you're going to see O'Hearn start versus every righty. Whether he's at first base or DH, he's going to be in there against every right-hander, and he's going to sit against every lefty. The Orioles have given him very few chances there. He's more of a platoon player. It's the big side of a platoon because he's a left-handed hitter. He will come off the bench. He will be a good pinch hitter. When there's a left-handed starter, O'Hearn will not start. And then a righty comes in a big spot. Ryan O'Hearn was 7 for 18 with a home run as a pinch hitter last year. He has shown over the last 2 seasons he is very comfortable in that pinch hitting role. And even when he's not starting, he is always ready to come off the bench. So that is going to happen. But I think, it was a 119 WRC plus last year. He cut the strikeouts way down. The projection systems have him doing a very similar thing offensively this year. If he does that, I'm fine with O'Hearn filling the exact same role for the Orioles, off the bench against lefties, starting against righties. I don't know if they bring him back. O'Hearn is due to be a free agent after 2025. I think that's a role that Kjerstad could take over fully in 2026. I'm not sure it's worth it to bring Ryan O'Hearn back, but be very interesting to see what he does. But I think he's a guy where I know his role. Where it's Mountcastle, it's like, there's a lot of questions. O'Hearn, it's like, it's going to be the exact same role he has played for the last 2 years because he's done it well, and I expect him to do so again in 2025. But those are the starters at those positions, catcher, first base, and DH. But there are other options on this roster. Coming up next, let's talk about the backups, the bench, and the depth for these spots for the O's coming up this season. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Wonderful Pistachios. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Every 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. Now, I love the classic variety. I like cracking open a snack, but also Wonderful Pistachios has a no shells variety with great flavors. You don't need to worry about the shell. You just reach into the bag and you've got a delicious, wonderful pistachio right there. They make it super easy. I like to work for it a little bit, but if you don't, they make it an easy and delicious snack. So get snackin' and get crackin' with a snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. So from the starters, we move to the bench options in the Orioles catcher, first base, and DH positional preview for 2025. Let's start with backup catcher because the Orioles have made a change here in 2025. Out is James McCann, who had been Adley Rutschman backup for the last 2 years. Now, McCann is still a free agent, kind of surprisingly. I'm recording this here on March 2nd. McCann is not yet signed with a team. I'm sure he's holding out for at least a major league deal to be a backup. The Orioles still need a little catching. We'll get to that. Maybe they could go to James McCann, but right now he's gone. The Orioles signed a 1-year, $8.5 million deal with Gary Sanchez to bring him in to be the backup. Now, he was basically a league average hitter, was Sanchez in Milwaukee as a backup last year to William Contreras. He was backing up maybe the best catcher in the NL last year. He's going to back up maybe the best catcher in the AL this year. Not a bad life for Gary Sanchez as he settled in as a backup. Now, we know Gary, right? He was the young phenom starting catcher for the Yankees for years. Good player, didn't pan out as much. Defense really struggled. Offense was up and down. What the Brewers have done is turned him into more of a solid offense, good defender. Like they fixed him as a framer. They fixed him as a defensive catcher. Really good work by what the Brewers did with Sanchez, and he turned it into a nice little deal as a backup catcher. Now, as I mentioned, I'm predicting Adley to catch around 100 games as a starter. That would mean Gary Sanchez catches, potentially 62 games this season. And it could move around a little bit if the Orioles carry 3 catchers at any point, but Gary Sanchez is going to catch at least, you'd think, 55 games starting behind the plate this season if he does not get injured. He was the starting catcher only 27 times for the Brewers last year. Now that's because, again, William Contreras is elite and he caught a lot. And the Brewers sometimes at times have had 3 catchers on that roster. So that fiddled with things a little bit. Sanchez, I believe, missed a little bit of time as well, so that's an issue there too. But I think when he catches, as I talked about with Adley, it's mostly going to be in two situations. One, if there's a lefty, they may want to get Sanchez behind the dish as the big right-handed hitter, 112 WRC plus in his career against lefties, and then have Adley DH because Adley is very, very good hitter against left-handed pitching, better than he is from the other side of the plate. And then also day game after a night game, we know about that. The O's will maybe try to line it up. Like if there's a situation where the O's have a weekend series, Friday and Sunday are right-handed starters for the opponent. Saturday is a lefty, and usually it's a Saturday night game, Sunday afternoon game. The Orioles may just have Sanchez catch Saturday night, and then on Sunday when it's back to the righty, then they have Adley catch. So he's still not catching the day game after a night game that he catches. He's just doing the inverse of it. They'll play with it to get the best matchups they want with Adley Rutschman and with Gary Sanchez, but he will catch a good amount. And I think the Orioles trust him defensively to pay him $8.5 million and know they're going to need him to catch 50 plus games as a starter behind the plate. And he's more of a veteran, solid backup at this point in his career with a higher ceiling than most backup catchers offensively because of how good he's been and how much power he has. It's still legitimate, crazy power, especially for a catcher. And like the Orioles faced, again, 42 left-handed starters last season. I expect Sanchez in there for a good chunk of those this year. And if you add in day games after night games, that does get him close to that 60 number. But the difference for Sanchez is going to be, he also was the DH 40 times for the Brewers last year. I'd be surprised if he even reaches 10 starts as the DH for the Orioles this year. Like it's possible he could do it if the O's are facing a long string of left-handed starters. He could flip-flop with Adley being DH and catcher. With just the options the Orioles have, and we'll go through it as well. We already talked about it with O'Hearn and Mountcastle. Again, maybe 5, 6, 7 times Gary Sanchez at the starting DH, but it's not going to be anywhere close to 40. So playing time is going to be kind of similar for Gary year to year, but it's going to be a lot more catching. And the Orioles wouldn't have signed him if they didn't think he was ready for it. That's kind of going to be his role heading into this year. Now, next catchers down the list is always important because it's really hard to get through an entire major league season using just 2 catchers. Rarely does a team do it because catchers get beat up and catchers get injured. Now, Samuel Basallo is obviously there. We'll talk about him in a bit, but I don't think, if one of these 2 guys gets injured in May, they're just going to call right up Samuel Basallo. There's still work to be done for him in AAA, despite how great his spring has been. Now, Gary Sanchez and Adley Rutschman, right now, the only 2 catchers on the Orioles 40-man roster. And I think Rockabacco wrote about this at Masson last week, but it's something I've been thinking about. They're a little light on catching depth right now. And I know it's probably because they have Basallo and they think he'll be ready by the end of this year. And once we get to next year, like it won't really be an issue. But for right now, if Adley or Gary picked up even like a minor injury, they're just a little light on that depth. The other non-roster invites in big league camp, along with Samuel Basallo, Silas Ardway was one of them. He's already back in minor league camp. That move was made on Sunday. So the only other 2 are David Banuelos, who appeared in 1 big league game for the Orioles last year. They re-signed him to a minor league deal this year. He's basically, they love him as the taxi squad catcher, like an extra bullpen catcher. They love him being around the guys. And then Maverick Hanley, who's a fantastic defender. He's been in AAA for a couple of years, but the bat has just never gotten there. Like Banuelos can be emergency situations, get activated. Hanley was the taxi squad catcher at times last year, but he's a guy who doesn't really hit much. Silas Ardway probably has the highest ceiling of them all. He was the Orioles number 33 ranked prospect in Fangraphs last year, but he hasn't even reached AAA yet, and he had a 72 WRC plus in AA last year, so the bat is certainly not ready for the big leagues. Like the Blake Hunts of the world, he was traded back over to the Mariners this offseason, the Anthony Bembooms of the world, the Mark Colesberries of the world, like these guys who are number 3 catchers who have big league time, they're not really here in this organization anymore. So it does kind of intrigue me, like what would the Orioles do if they suffered an injury to either Rutschman or Gary Sanchez at some point? Now, I think if it was, Adley or Gary picked up a quick injury, 10-day IL stint, and in 2 weeks at most, you're back on the roster, then I think they could handle one of David Banuelos or Maverick Hanley, just come into the big leagues, be the backup catcher. If it's a 2-week stint, they start 2 or 3 of the games, they hit ninth, they do what they need to do defensively, and the Orioles get through. However, if there's a longer term injury for either Adley or Gary, I think they would actually consider bringing up Samuel Basallo like in June if it happened earlier than they wanted to, because I don't know if you can go with Maverick Handley or David Banuelos as your backup catcher for a long time. And especially if it were Adley that went down. If it were Gary Sanchez that went down, maybe they could stomach Banuelos or Handley in there for a while as the backup. But if it were Adley that went down and Gary Sanchez became your starter, I think they could go to Samuel Basallo and just call him up and use him. But I think more likely than that, because they wouldn't want to rush Basallo to the big leagues just because of an injury. They see big things for him, as do I really think they would turn to signing or trading for a catcher. And right now, as I record this March 2nd, Luke Maile, Yasmani Grandal, and James McCann are the best free agent catchers who are still unsigned. I mean, if Gary Sanchez got injured tomorrow and it was going to be like a multiple month thing, I think the Orioles would just go sign James McCann. I think they'd offer him 1 year, $5-6 million, say, hey, nobody else is paying you. Just come back and do the same job you've done for the last 2 years. And if he's still available in May and there's an injury like that, I think they would do it as well. But it's kind of a weird spot. Like, you usually have another veteran with big league experience. So I wouldn't be surprised if they was brought in a guy like a Luke Maile on a minor league deal, just to have in AAA, have in camp just in case. It's kind of interesting that they haven't done that, at least to this point. I mean, they tried to do it right. They had Rene Pinto for a while, but then they had to put him on waivers. He got claimed. They had Blank Hunt for a while. He came over in the Mike Baumann trade. They had to put him on waivers. He got claimed, so they traded him to the Mariners. So they've had this idea. They liked Pinto. They liked Hunt. They weren't able to hold on to them just because of roster crunch. So actually, maybe look out for if there's other catchers that come on waivers in the coming weeks, the Orioles to maybe be active on the waiver wire to get someone else who has some veteran experience in camp. Now, in terms of DH and first base, there's plenty of other guys who will see times at DH, right? We've talked about Adley and Gary Sanchez and O'Hearn doing it. You'll see Kjerstad there at times. Maybe if Adley's catching versus a lefty and Sanchez isn't playing, you could see some of that. You could see some Tyler O'Neill at DH just to keep him in the lineup, but keep him out of the field, a better chance of keeping him healthy with all the injury issues he has had. And, you know, the Orioles like to rotate the DH spot to keep guys healthy, give them like a quote-unquote half day off. 9 different players started at DH for the Orioles in 2024. They're going to do some of that again. And then in terms of first base depth, like Emmanuel Rivera is in camp. He can play that position. He did it last year. They could call him up if they needed to. Like, you have TT Bowens in AAA if you really need it. But if anything happened at first base, even if the Orioles, you know, maybe not looking totally ready this spring or last season in the bigs, Coby Mayo would be that next call. And that is where we finish off the episode coming up next. The prospects at these positions who could make an impact now and in the future for the Orioles. It's the Orioles 2025 catcher, first base, and DH preview. We finish things off with the prospects at those positions, and we begin with Samuel Basallo, Orioles' #1 prospect and a pretty much consensus top 10 prospect in baseball, just 20 years old, doesn't turn 21 until August. Huge left-handed hitter, 134 WRC plus in AA at age 19 last year. The average AA pitcher is age 23. He got up to AAA, struggled a bit at the plate in his 21 games in Norfolk before the end of the season. So you still want to see him go back to AAA, where he will begin this year, and start to dominate there too before you start thinking about a big league call-up. But Basallo has looked great this spring. It's an elite bat from the left side, incredible power, really good hit tool, doesn't really strike out a ton either. The catching still needs some work, but the arm strength is ridiculous. He just showed it off over the weekend. And the other stuff, the framing, the blocking, it is improving rapidly. Like, he is getting better and better week by week. He has honestly showed it off in spring. Like, there's been some Samuel Basallo receiving highlights I have seen on the internet, because he's getting better at framing and receiving and blocking. Like, he is getting closer and closer to being a big leaguer. Now, if he hits well in AAA, I think we're going to see him in the major leagues, even if it's not because of any kind of injury like I just talked about in the last segment. I think we're going to see Basallo in the big leagues if he starts to crush AAA this season. I think it would be as a September call-up, where they wouldn't really ask him to catch much. They'd mostly ask him to maybe play a little first base, which he's done, but mostly DH and be a pinch hitter for the Orioles in September when the rosters expand and you can add one extra hitter. I think there's a chance that hitter is Samuel Basallo. It gives you flexibility with a third catcher, but also just gives you this big hulking left-handed bat to add to your lineup. And then I think defensively, I have the confidence he's going to be fully ready defensively to be a major league catcher by 2026, I think we could see Basallo on the Orioles opening day roster. Gary Sanchez leaves after a 1-year deal, and you have the most interesting and talented catching combination in baseball with Rutschman and Basallo heading into the 2026 season. I really think that's what it's going to be. They'll both play a lot. They'll mix and match. They might carry a third catcher, but it's going to be a really, really interesting duo that they have there. And then really the other prospect to talk about here is Coby Mayo, a first baseman / third baseman, Orioles #2 prospect. Again, kind of a consensus top 50 prospect in all of baseball. We saw him make his debut at the end of last year. He went 4 for 41, didn't look super comfortable at the plate, went back down to AAA, and wasn't a factor, wasn't on the Orioles postseason roster, but he's fighting for a spot this spring. Hasn't been great in spring so far, and there's really not a spot, just like Basallo, who definitely won't be on the opening day roster. Mayo has a better shot, but unless someone gets injured, there's not really a spot for Mayo right now. If you go back and listen to last Friday's episode with Gunnar Henderson, Jordan Westberg dealing with some injuries, I talked about how if those guys started the year on the IL, that could be an opening for Mayo to make the team. But otherwise, he's probably going to go back to Norfolk and just refine some things offensively and defensively before he probably gets his real shot this year. That's where the whole Ryan Mountcastle conversation comes back in, is with Coby Mayo. Like, it's this huge power from the right side. It's an interesting swing, but it works for him. He's got this huge upside, but there are definitely questions about his defense at third base, especially the accuracy of his throwing arm. I think the Orioles see him more as a first baseman defensively long-term than a third baseman, which is why he comes up in this episode and not the following infield positional preview episode. But he could play some third and some first. He did them both at the major leagues for the Orioles last year and in the minors, and he's going to do it again in 2025. It's just at some point this season, either Ryan Mountcastle is going to struggle, there's going to be an injury, they're going to trade someone like Mountcastle there. You have to think there's going to be an opening for Coby Mayo. If he keeps hitting like he does in AAA, the Orioles are going to find a way to get him in there. But with Gunnar Henderson, Jordan Westberg, Jackson Holliday, and you added O'Hearn and Mountcastle, it's just tough to find a spot for Coby Mayo to be on this team. And it's one of those situations where for Mayo, I don't want him as a bench bat on this team. Like, there's still things for him to work on, clearly. 4 for 41 with 22 strikeouts in the big leagues last year with some shaky defense. There are things for him to work on in Norfolk. I'd rather him be playing every day in Norfolk than sitting on the bench and just playing against some lefties in the big leagues. A guy like Ramon Arias makes way more sense as the Orioles' utility infielder on the bench for this big league roster than does Coby Mayo in terms of their development and a long-term health and success for the Orioles. Now, it's still not out of the question that he could be a top trade chip to go and get an ace. Like, if the Orioles want to go and get Sandy Alcantara from the Marlins early this season, could you send Coby Mayo to Miami to reunite with Kyle Stowers and Connor Norby and get yourself Alcantara? Like, that is certainly a possibility still. And I'm not really worried about the rough start in the big leagues for Mayo. Join the club. But it might take the Mountcastle struggles or an injury or a Mountie trade or whatever for Mayo to get there. But Mayo's going to be waiting. He's going to do what he needs to do in AAA to be waiting. And if Mountcastle budges or there's an injury or there's a trade there, like, Mayo's going to be ready to pounce on those plate appearances, on those at-bats, and that chance at the big leagues. I'm just really intrigued to see if there's not any kind of injury and the other guys are producing, what the Orioles do with Coby Mayo in 2025, because there could be a trade, could be a call-up, it could be just kind of sitting in AAA till late in the year when he can help him as a bench bat. Intriguing year coming up for Coby Mayo, but hey, the Orioles' top 2 prospects, Mayo and Basallo, fit right into these categories: catcher, first base, and DH for the O's in 2025. But let me know in the comments here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page how you think Adley's playing time will play out in 2025 and how much they use Gary Sanchez, how the Orioles will put together their lineups with Mountcastle and O'Neill and Kerstad and all these guys. Going to be hard to fit them in. And then I want to know your thoughts, like when you think Basallo and Mayo will make a true impact for the Orioles in 2025. I want to see some good discussion in the YouTube comments here, because I still don't have all the answers on this one. I am really intrigued to see how this positional preview plays out. That's why I wanted to do it first. I think it's the most intriguing of all of them for the Orioles. But that'll do it for this episode. We will be back tomorrow. Final 2024 season recap episode of the offseason. We finally made it. We're talking about Jackson Holliday, what he did in his first couple of big league stints, what he has changed, and why that's going to set him up for success this season. That's coming up on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.